All right, welcome back. Today we're going to look at topic 5. Topic 5 is the distributive property and how we can use that to factor. Okay, so back in secondary math 1, you guys should remember the greatest common factor. Okay, so greatest common factor is the largest number that goes into any number. Okay, it's a factor. So what we're going to do to use this distributive property is to look at our terms and decide between the two of them what our greatest common factor is. So between 27 and 18, your greatest common factor is going to be 9. And between the y squared and the y, the greatest common factor would be a y. So in terms of that, you are going to take out the greatest common factor, which is 9y. Now, when you're using this distributive property, you're actually going to think in terms of division. So we're going to be dividing both of those by that 9y. Okay? And what our resulting terms do is they go back into a parenthesis value here. So you take 27 divided by 9. 27 divided by 9 is 3. And then y squared divided by y. You're subtracting your exponent. So 2 minus 1 is 1. And you end up with 3y. Over here, the 18 divided by 9 gives you a 2. And then the y divided by y essentially cancel each other out, turns into a 1. And that would be your resulting answer right here. Now you can prove this and check it by using that distributive property. Okay, so I take and multiply these. 9 times 3 and y times y gives you a 27y squared. 9y times 2 is 18y. Okay, that's multiplying a monomial by a polynomial, and you end up right back in your beginning spot. That shows you that is your final answer. Now in the second example, we've got a few extra terms. We've got a's and b's in here. We've got numbers. We've got 3 total terms. Process is the same. So we look at all of these, 4, 8, 2. Try and find that greatest common factor, and in this case, it's going to be a 2. Sorry. Now you look at variables. They each share an a, so I'm going to pull an a out as well. And they all share at least one b, so I'm going to factor that b as well. And remember, factoring is division, so I'm going to do 2ab out of all of these. Now it's important to remember this because this actually ends up causing some mistakes in a lot of problems. So we divide this. You got a negative 4 divided by 2 is going to be a negative 2. A squared divided by a is an a, and then b divided by b is 1. It is out of the problem. You got negative 8 divided by 2 is a negative 4. A divided by a, out of the problem. B squared divided by b is a b, and there's that. And then finally, a 2ab divided by 2ab, those turn into a 1, and there's your final answer. Now, a lot of times, students will completely eliminate that 1, and you have to have it because if you redistribute, you have to have that last term. If you take that 1 out, you will not have that last term. Okay, so that's using the distributive property. You can see it's essentially just distributing backwards, okay, and that's known as factoring. Now, what I want you guys to do is pause the video, try problems C and D, and see what you end up with. We'll come back in just a second. Okay, hopefully you guys had time to work through these. So 15W, 3R, the greatest common factor there is just going to be that 3. So you factor the 3 out, and again, remember that's just division. Now whether you show this or not, it's up to you. As you guys progress, I'm sure you won't need it. But if you need to, do it. So 15 divided by 3 is 5, and the W stays. The 3 divided by 3 is 1. You're left with your R, so it's 1R. And that is your final answer. Now down here, in this next step, looking again for greatest common factor, you've got a 7, a 21, and a 1. A number's not going to come out, but you've got a U, and a U, so we're going to pull a U out. Sorry, did that again. You've got a T squared, and a T. So the greatest common factor is just that 1 T. So I pull out that UT. Here's my division. And then I'm going to have a 7, a U, and a T left here. So 7, U, T. In this one, I'm going to have a 21. My U's are gone, but I still do have a T. So it's plus 21T. And then here I've got UT divided by UT, which is 1. And you do have that negative, so you've got a minus 1. And that is your final answer for that one. Okay, so that's using the distributive property backwards, also known as factoring. The second part, we're going to look at something called factor by grouping. Now, factor by grouping occurs when you have 4 terms, and that's an important thing to remember. You're going to want 4 terms here. Now, when you factor by grouping, you take 4 of these and break them down into 2 groups of 2. So I'm going to group things that have something in common. So these 2 have something in common, as well as these 2. And so I factor them out just like these ones. So these 2 have a 4R in common. That leaves me with a Q plus 2. These ones have a 3 in common. So I factor out the 3. That leaves me with Q plus 2. It's this exact same step that we previously talked about, just going through in each of those groups. Now, when we looked at foiling, we talked about the distributive property and how that's breaking up. This is essentially the same thing. What ends up happening is you take these 2 values here that come out and group them together as 1. So it's 4R plus 3. Then you take the thing that is duplicated, and they actually group down into one binomial. And it ends up as Q plus 2, and that is your final answer. Okay, now if you think of how FOIL works, we multiply this times both of those, which represents that. We multiply this by both of those, which represents that. And that is then your final answer. Okay, let's look at B. Now between these ones, these do have something in common. And these do as well. Okay, now notice I'm putting that minus sign on the inside. I'll explain why in just a second. So I try and pull something out of here. They both have an N. So I pull this N out, and I'm left with the R plus 5. Now what you guys should notice up in this last example is these 2 things ended up the same. That's your goal in factor by grouping. You want those 2 things to be the same. So I need to turn this into an R plus 5. Well, right now they both have a negative sign. So the way that I can change those things from negative to positive is to factor out a negative 1. And now negative R divided by negative 1 is a positive R. Negative 5 divided by negative 1 is a positive 5. And now those are the same. Okay, so I group these things together. Remember the 2 things that come out go together, so I got N minus 1. The thing that repeats, that factor goes in there, and there is your final answer. All right, take a second, pause the video, try problem C. We'll come back in just a second and look at it. All right, so like on this last one, we take and we group. So we're going to group these 2 together, and we're going to group these 2 together, and see what we can pull out. So for both of those, I can pull a 3 and a P. So we take out a 3P. That leaves me with an N here, and just a 5 here. So 15 divided by 3 is 5, and the P's eliminated. Okay, over here, I know my goal has to be an N plus 5. So both of those have a 4 in common, but that would leave me with some negatives. So I'm going to pull out a negative 4, and that ends up being then N plus 5. Okay, and you can always work backwards to make sure it matches up. And then finally, we pull out what we have and regroup them. So my 3P minus 4 comes together, the N plus 5 comes together, and that is your final answer. Now all of this leads up to solving equations. And in algebras, geometry, even in the higher level maths, we always want to solve these things. Okay, so this time we are solving. We're going to use something called the zero product property. Now what the zero product property says is if 2 things are multiplied together and the answer is 0, one or the other has to be 0. The only way 2 things can multiply together and the answer be 0 is if one or the other is 0. So what that does is it breaks it down into its 2 factors. So here are the 2 factors. Well, my answer is 0, so that means that this has to be 0 or this has to be 0. We have to decide what numbers make that happen. And what you're going to do is you're going to take both of these factors and set them up individually and equal them to 0. Now what that does is it gives you 2 equations. And when you solve those 2 equations, it's 2 values for D that if I were to substitute it back in, one of these will be 0, and that means the whole answer is 0. Okay, so we solve this. This is just solving an equation. So subtract 6. You got 2D equals a negative 6 divided by 2, and D equals a negative 3. There's your first answer. Solving this one, you add your 15. So those cancel. You got a 3D equals 15 divided by 3, and so D equals 5, and those both are your answers to this problem. So these ones will have 2. Now on a problem like B, they are not in a position where we can set them up, but we look at these and we try and identify any greatest common factors. Okay, well, greatest common factor between 8 and 40 is 8. And the greatest common factor between b squared and b is a b. So I can factor that out. So using my division, similar to what we did in the previous part of this lesson, 8 divided by 8 is 1, b squared divided by b is b. And then 40 divided by 8 is 5, b divided by b cancels out. So I've got my minus 5 in there, and I set that equal to 0. Now, just like this previous one up here, we set each part equal to 0. So 8p or 8b equals 0, b minus 5 equals 0, and solve. So divide by 8. That gives you b equals 0, and then add 5. That gives you b equals 5. So you could say that b is 0 and 5, and there are your two answers. Hopefully this cleared some things up. If you have any questions, be sure to contact me, and good luck on your assignment.